The air in the Providence Town Hall on October 28, 1876, was thick with the scent of wet wool, stale pipe smoke, and the self-satisfaction of men accustomed to making decisions. Outside, a belligerent wind, the first true harbinger of a Dakota winter, clawed at the window panes. Inside, Alara stood alone before the council, a solitary figure in a plain, mended dress that did little to conceal the gentle swell of her belly. She was 22 years old, a widow of 4 months, and, as of that morning, homeless. Her husband, Samuel, had been taken by a swift and merciless pneumonia in late June, leaving her with a half-finished cabin on a plot of land she could not legally hold without him. The claim had reverted to the railroad, and the notice of eviction, tacked to her door by a man who refused to meet her gaze, had been the final, brutal postscript to her grief. Now, she faced the 5 men who constituted the town's leadership. Elder Thompson, his face a roadmap of pious certainty, presided. Beside him sat Silas Croft, the blacksmith, whose powerful hands were steepled under his chin, and 3 other landowners whose expressions ranged from mild pity to outright impatience. "We have discussed your situation, Mistress Alara," Elder Thompson began, his voice a low rumble that filled the small room. "It is unfortunate, deeply unfortunate. The church will, of course, provide what charity it can. A place in the livery stable loft can be made available for you, temporarily." The livery stable. The words hung in the air, cold and sharp. It meant a bed of loose straw, the constant ammonia stench of the animals, and a thin blanket against a winter that promised to be one of the harshest in memory. It was a place to die slowly, not a place to bring a new life into the world. Alara drew a steadying breath, her hands clasped before her to still their trembling. "I thank you for the offer, Elder," she said, her voice clear and even, betraying none of the terror that coiled in her gut. "But I do not come seeking charity. I come with a proposal, a solution not only for myself, but for the town's greater concern." Silas Croft shifted in his chair, a flicker of interest crossing his broad face. "The wood shortage," he stated, more to himself than to her. It was the unspoken fear in every home. The previous winter had been long, and the summer's logging had been meager due to a fever that swept through the lumber camp. Every family was rationing, eyeing their woodpiles with a growing sense of dread. "Precisely," Alara affirmed. "My grandmother was of the old peoples, from the hills far to the east. She taught me that the strongest shelter is not the one that fights the winter, but the one that joins it. The earth itself is the greatest shield against the cold." She paused, letting the statement settle. "The sandstone bluff south of the creek. It faces the sun. It is stable. I propose to excavate a dwelling with... It would take a team of men with blasting powder months to make a dent in that bluff. I do not need a cavern, Mr. Croft. I need a room. 12 feet wide, perhaps 16 feet deep, with a ceiling tall enough for a man to stand. The sandstone there is sedimentary. It can be worked with a rock hammer and chisels. It will be slow, methodical work, but it is not impossible. I have my husband's tools, and I have the will to see it done before the first deep snow." She looked directly at Elder Thompson, her gaze unwavering. "All I ask is the council's permission to work that small, unused section of public land. I ask for no supplies, no assistance, only the right to provide for myself and my child." The condescension in Elder Thompson's face deepened into a kind of paternalistic pity. "My dear woman," he said, his tone dripping with false kindness, "you are overwrought with grief and the anxieties of your condition. Your mind is addled with fanciful notions from pagan ancestors. Building is men's work. It requires an understanding of loads and stresses, of timber framing and joinery, not burrowing." He waved a dismissive hand. "We cannot sanction such a dangerous and frankly embarrassing endeavor. It would be an eyesore, a testament to folly. You will accept the place in the livery loft. It is for your own good." The finality in his voice was absolute. The other men nodded in agreement, their brief curiosity extinguished. They saw a hysterical widow, not a pragmatic survivor. They heard the babbling of a troubled mind, not the echo of ancestral wisdom. Ilara felt a cold, hard anger crystallize within her. It was not a hot, fleeting rage, but a dense, heavy certainty. They were wrong. Their conventional wisdom, their rigid adherence to what they knew, was a cage of their own making. "I see," she said softly. The fight had gone from her voice, replaced by a quiet resolve that they mistook for acquiescence. "Thank you for your time, gentlemen." She turned and walked from the room, her back straight, her head held high. She did not go to the livery stable. She went instead to the small general store, her mind already moving past the men in the hall, past their scorn and their short-sightedness. The debate was over in their minds, but in hers, the work had just begun. On the morning of November 1st, 1876, Ilara stood at the base of the south-facing sandstone bluff. A cold, determined sun shone from a pale blue sky. In her hands, she held the sum total of her worldly wealth, not in coin, but in steel. The day before, she had sold her late husband's silver pocket watch and her own mother's locket, the last sentimental ties to her past. The transaction had netted her $27. With it, she had purchased a new 16-pound rock hammer, a heavy-bladed spade, 2 tempered steel chisels of differing widths, a sturdy wheelbarrow, and a small supply of dried beans and salted pork. The expenditure left her with exactly $47 in silver coins, a meager fortress against the coming winter. She had chosen her spot with meticulous care, applying the lessons her grandmother had imparted during long summer evenings years ago. The location was a third of the way up the bluff's face, on a natural ledge that would place her dwelling well above any potential spring floodwaters. The rock here was a consistent, layered sandstone, free of the granite intrusions that marked other sections. Crucially, the cliff face was angled almost perfectly to the south, ensuring it would receive the maximum possible exposure to the low winter sun. This was the foundational principle of her plan: passive solar gain. The sun's warmth would be the fuel, the earth the battery. The first task was clearing the site. For 2 days she labored, removing the thorny scrub brush and loose scree from the ledge. Her hands, soft from a life of domestic work, were quickly blistered, then torn. She ignored the pain, wrapping them in strips of cloth and continuing her work. She used the spade to scrape away the topsoil, exposing the raw, pale orange face of the stone. The area she cleared measured approximately 15 feet wide and 20 feet deep, giving her a small, flat work area in front of her intended excavation. Then came the true test. On November 3rd, she picked up the rock hammer and the wider of the 2 chisels. The steel felt alien and heavy in her grasp. She set the chisel's edge against the rock and swung the hammer. The resulting clang was pathetically small, and the chip of stone that broke away was no bigger than her thumbnail. A wave of despair, cold and sharp, washed over her. The council's mocking words echoed in her ears. A badger in a hole. Men's work. For a long moment, she simply stood there, the hammer hanging limply at her side, the vast, silent indifference of the bluff seeming to press in on her. But then she felt a faint flutter deep within her womb, a tiny, insistent reminder of the life that depended on her. The despair receded, replaced again by that cold, dense resolve. This was not a matter of a single, mighty blow. It was a matter of 1,000, of 10,000, of 100,000 patient, persistent strikes. It was not about brute strength, which she did not possess in abundance, but about endurance, which she had in limitless supply. She adjusted her grip, found a rhythm. Strike, adjust. Strike, adjust. She learned to read the stone, to see the faint fracture lines and work with them, not against them. The sound of her labor became a steady, metronomic beat against the silence of the prairie. The sharp ring of steel on steel, the deeper crunch of chisel into stone. By the end of the first day of digging, she had created a depression barely 6 inches deep and a few feet wide. It was a pathetic scar on the face of the cliff, but it was a start. She worked from sunup to sundown, stopping only to eat a small meal of cold beans and drink from the canteen of water she hauled from the creek each morning. As the days turned into a week, then 2, her body adapted to the brutal labor. The blisters on her hands became thick calluses. The muscles in her back and shoulders, once aching with protest, hardened into taut cords. She lost weight from her face and arms, but her core remained strong, her movements economical and efficient. A routine was established. Each morning, she would spend the first hour clearing the rubble from the previous day's work, hauling it in the wheelbarrow to the edge of the ledge and dumping it down the slope. Then, the digging would commence. The outline of her dwelling began to take shape. She was not merely digging a hole, she was sculpting a space. She worked inwards, creating a rectangular opening that was to be the entrance. She kept the ceiling low at first, only 5 feet, knowing she could heighten it later. This conserved energy and allowed her to focus on gaining depth. By mid-November, she had penetrated more than 6 feet into the bluff. The air inside her burgeoning cavern was already noticeably different, still cool and free of the biting wind. Her solitary work did not go unnoticed. Occasionally, a townsman would ride out on the pretext of checking traps, only to stop and stare from a distance at the strange, slow-motion demolition she was performing on the cliffside. Silas Croft came by once. He sat on his horse for a long time, watching her steady, rhythmic hammering. He did not mock her. He simply watched, his expression unreadable, before turning his horse and riding away. Others were less charitable. A group of boys, emboldened by their father's dinner-table dismissals of the crazy widow, threw rocks at her from the top of the bluff one afternoon. They scattered when she emerged from her tunnel, her face grim, the heavy rock hammer held in one hand. They did not return. She encountered a significant setback on November 20th. She hit a layer of chert, a type of microcrystalline quartz that was far harder than the surrounding sandstone. Her chisels, which had been effective against the softer rock, barely scratched its surface. For 2 full days, her progress ground to a halt. Frustration gnawed at her. She spent hours examining the stubborn layer, running her hands over its smooth, flinty surface. Giving up was not an option. She had to go through it. The solution, when it came, was born of her grandmother's teachings. Fire and water are the earth's tools for shaping itself, the old woman had told her. Use them. That evening, Alara gathered a large pile of dry brush and wood, hauling it to her work site. She built a massive, intense fire directly against the chert layer, feeding it for hours until the rock was almost too hot to touch. Then, using a bucket, she began hauling water from the creek, trip after arduous trip, and doused the superheated stone. The effect was immediate and dramatic. With a series of sharp cracks and pops, the chert fractured as the rapid temperature change created immense internal stress. The next morning, she found the hard layer shattered into a mosaic of manageable pieces. It took her another day to clear the debris, but she had broken through. The obstacle had cost her 3 precious days, but it had also deepened her understanding of the materials she worked with. By the first week of December, the main chamber was complete. The final interior space measured precisely 12 feet wide and 16 feet deep. She had painstakingly raised the ceiling to a height of 7 feet, a task that involved building a temporary scaffold of scavenged wood and working overhead, a shower of sandstone dust constantly raining down on her. The walls were rough, but they were solid. She had entered the heart of the bluff. Now, she turned her attention to the refinements that would transform the cavern from a hole into a home. Along the back wall, she carved out a raised platform, 2 feet high and 6 feet wide. This would be her bed, elevating her from the coldest air that would settle on the floor. Near the front, to one side of the entrance, she began the most complex piece of the construction, the smoke hole and ventilation shaft. She knew that a simple hole in the roof would not suffice. It would allow precious heat to escape and could become blocked by snow. Instead, she began chiseling a narrow shaft, only 8 inches in diameter, straight up from a spot designated for her fire pit. It was agonizingly slow work, done with her smallest chisel and a lighter hammer. After carving upwards for 4 feet, she began to angle the shaft, directing it towards the cliff face. Her goal was to create an L-shaped flue that would exit horizontally from the bluff, several feet above the main entrance. This design, another piece of ancestral engineering, would use the principles of convection and the draw of the outside wind to pull smoke out efficiently while minimizing heat loss. It took her an entire week of strained, meticulous work, but when she finally broke through to the outside, creating a small, dark opening on the cliff face, a profound sense of accomplishment washed over her. The final major structural element was the cold trap. At the entrance, she excavated the floor downwards, creating a sunken entryway 3 feet deeper than the main living space. Cold air, being denser than warm air, would flow into the entrance and become trapped in this well, preventing it from spilling into the main chamber. Anyone entering the home would have to step down and then up again. It was a simple but remarkably effective design for maintaining a stable interior temperature. With the heavy excavation finished, she focused on the interior surfaces. The raw sandstone walls constantly shed a fine dust. To remedy this, she mixed the clay she had scraped away at the very beginning of her dig with water, creating a thick, smooth plaster. Over several days, she painstakingly coated every surface of the main chamber: walls, ceiling, even the sleeping platform. The clay dried to a hard, smooth finish, sealing the porous rock and giving the interior a clean, earthen scent. The color was a warm, welcoming terracotta that seemed to glow in the lantern light. Her last project was the door. She used planks salvaged from her husband's abandoned cabin, hauling them the half-mile to her new home. She was no carpenter, but she managed to fashion a solid, functional door, reinforcing it with a cross brace. For hinges and a latch, she had to make a trip back into Providence, her first in over a month. She walked into the general store, her face smudged with dust, her hands calloused and raw. The storekeeper, who had been among the men who had silently pitied her, stared at her as if she were a ghost. She bought the hardware she needed, paying with the last of her coin from the sale of her watch. The total cost of her materials, tools, hardware, and initial provisions came to $34. On December 18, 1876, she fitted the door into the frame she had carved into the sandstone. It swung shut with a solid, satisfying thud, sealing her inside. She lit a small fire in the designated pit. The smoke hesitated for a moment, then, as the draft in the new flue caught, it was drawn up and out, leaving the air in the chamber clear. A single lantern cast a warm, golden light on the smooth clay walls. She placed her hand against the rock of the back wall. It was cool to the touch, but it was not the biting, life-leeching cold of a wooden plank wall. It was the deep, steady coolness of the earth, a reservoir of neutral temperature. Outside, the wind howled, and the first heavy snowflakes of the season began to fall. Inside her sanctuary, it was silent. She was ready. The first few weeks of true winter were a validation of her labor. The snows came, blanketing the prairie in a thick layer of white. The temperatures in Providence plummeted, rarely rising above 10 degrees during the day and dropping well below zero at night. The sound of axes splitting firewood became a constant, frantic percussion in the town, a drumbeat of anxiety. In her cliffside dwelling, Alara experienced a different reality. The temperature inside her home, without a fire lit, never dropped below 48 degrees Fahrenheit. The immense thermal mass of the surrounding rock acted as a colossal heat sink, stabilizing the interior environment against the wild fluctuations outside. Her days fell into a peaceful, solitary rhythm. She spent very little time outside. When she did, it was to gather a bucket of fresh snow to melt for water, or to check the snares she had set for rabbits along the base of the bluff. Most of her time was spent inside, preparing for the birth of her child. She sewed diapers from old flour sacks and fashioned a small bassinet from woven willow branches. A small, controlled fire for cooking and boiling water was all she needed, and the meager pile of scavenged wood she had gathered seemed an almost inexhaustible supply compared to the great stacks being devoured in town. The silence was profound. The thick stone walls muted the ceaseless howl of the wind to a distant, ignorable whisper. It was a silence of safety, of profound and hard-won security. In Providence, the mood was darkening. The wood shortage was no longer a future concern, it was a present and deepening crisis. Families began to burn furniture. Frost formed thick and feathery on the inside of cabin windows. A persistent, hacking cough echoed through the town, and the doctor was run ragged treating cases of what he called lung fever. Elder Thompson preached sermons on endurance and the testing of faith, but his words offered little warmth against the encroaching cold. The men who had dismissed Alara's plan now faced the consequences of their conventional thinking. Their well-built log cabins, the very symbols of their mastery over the wilderness, were proving to be terribly inefficient thermal sieves, demanding a constant, ravenous tribute of firewood to keep the killing cold at bay. On the night of January 5th, 1877, Alara went into labor. She was alone, as she had known she would be, but she was not afraid. Her home was warm and safe. She had clean water and a soft bed of furs on her raised platform. The birth was long and difficult, but as the first light of a frozen dawn filtered through the small, glass-paned window she had set into her door, she held her son in her arms. He was small, but healthy, his cry a vibrant, startling sound in the quiet of the cave. She named him Samuel, after the father he would never know. A week later, the true test came. The sky turned a strange, bruised yellow-gray, and the wind, which had been a constant companion, fell utterly silent. The air grew heavy, and an unnatural stillness settled over the land. Alara, watching through her small window, recognized the signs her grandmother had described. This was not a storm. This was a blizzard. She brought her remaining wood inside, checked the seal on her door, and made sure the external opening of her flue was clear. Then she settled in with her newborn son, secure in the heart of the stone. The blizzard hit Providence like a physical blow. It did not begin with gentle flakes, but with a solid wall of white that instantly erased the world. The wind returned with a terrifying, shrieking violence that drove the snow horizontally, packing it into every crack and crevice. The temperature plunged to 20, then 30, then 40 degrees below zero. It was impossible to see more than a few feet. It was suicide to be caught outside. The town was paralyzed, each family isolated in its own fragile fortress of wood. For 3 days, the storm raged without pause. Inside the cabins, the battle for warmth became desperate. Woodpiles vanished. The interiors of the homes became as cold as the outdoors, save for the small halo of heat around the stoves. Water froze in buckets just feet from the fire. Silas Croft's youngest daughter, Martha, fell gravely ill, her breathing shallow and ragged. The doctor couldn't reach her. The Croft cabin, despite being one of the best built in town, was losing the war. The fire was roaring, devouring their last pieces of split oak, yet the cold was winning. On the third day of the blizzard, a section of the town hall's roof collapsed under the immense weight of the snow. Elder Thompson and several other men had taken refuge there, pooling their firewood. They barely escaped as the heavy, snow-laden timbers gave way. They staggered through the blinding whiteout to the blacksmith shop, their faces caked in ice, their hope nearly extinguished. They found Silas Croft staring into his nearly empty wood box, his daughter's weak cries barely audible from the next room. "It's no use," Silas said, his voice hoarse with despair. "We're burning the last of the furniture. When it's gone, the fire goes out. Martha won't last the night without warmth." Elder Thompson, his face a mask of frost and fear, leaned against the forge. His certainty, his piety, his authority, all of it had been, "We'd freeze before we got 100 yards. "It's our only chance," Silas Croft said, his voice suddenly hard as the steel he forged. He looked at the faces of the men around him, the very men who had sat in judgment of Alara. He saw their fear and their shame. "My daughter is dying. We can die here by the fire, or we can die out there trying to find help. I'm going." He began to pull on his heaviest coats, his movements stiff with cold and resolve. "I need 2 men. We'll tie a rope between us. We'll follow the creek bed. It should lead us to the base of the bluff." After a moment of hesitation, Elder Thompson nodded, his face grim. "I will go." The young landowner who had first mentioned her name also stepped forward. The 3 men bundled themselves against the impossible cold, took up a coil of rope and a single flickering lantern, and stepped out into the screaming, white fury of the blizzard. The journey was a nightmare. The wind tore at them, stealing their breath and driving ice crystals into their eyes. The snow was waist-deep, a thick, sucking powder that made every step an act of supreme exertion. They could not see. They could not hear anything but the storm's roar. They navigated by instinct and memory, keeping the slight depression of the frozen creek bed on their left. Twice, the young landowner fell, and was saved only by the rope that bound him to the others. The lantern cast a pathetic, dancing circle of light that was swallowed by the white chaos just inches from the glass. They were guided by a single, desperate image: a woman digging into a cliff. After what felt like an eternity, Silas Croft stumbled, his foot hitting not soft snow, but hard, angled rock. The base of the bluff. They had made it. They began to work their way along it, shouting Alara's name into the wind, their voices instantly ripped away. Hope was beginning to fade. Perhaps her entrance was buried. Perhaps she had never even finished it. Perhaps she had frozen to death weeks ago, a testament to her own foolishness. It was Elder Thompson who saw it first. A faint, rectangular patch on the snow-blasted cliff face, darker than the surrounding stone. A door. As they drew closer, they saw a tiny, almost imperceptible wisp of smoke being snatched from a small hole a few feet above it. She was alive. Silas Croft hammered on the wooden planks with his frozen fist. For a moment, there was no response. Then, the door swung inward. Light and warmth spilled out into the blizzard. The three men, half frozen and blinded by the sudden glow, stared in disbelief. There stood Alara, holding a small bundle of blankets in her arms. Her face was calm, her hair was tidy. Behind her, they could see not a dark, damp cave, but a clean, warm, well-lit room. The air that washed over them was not cold, but carried the scent of wood smoke, baked bread, and life. It was a stable, gentle warmth, a stark, shocking contrast to the lethal cold they had just endured. "Mr. Croft," Alara said, her voice even, "you are a long way from home in this storm." Silas could not speak. He could only stare past her, at the smooth clay walls, the raised sleeping platform, the small, efficient fire. He stared at the impossible, life-saving reality of the very thing he had dismissed as a woman's fancy. He saw the child in her arms, and the shame hit him with the force of a physical blow. "My daughter," he finally managed to stammer, his words cracking. "She's sick. The cold. We're out of wood. His voice failed him. Ilara's expression softened. There was no triumph in her eyes, no "I told you so." There was only a quiet, profound compassion. "Bring her here," she said simply. "Bring anyone who needs shelter. There is room, and it is warm." She stepped back, holding the door open, a silent invitation from her world of quiet wisdom into theirs of shattered certainty. The vindicated sage was ready to save her flock. The rescue was a slow, arduous process that consumed the rest of the day and stretched into the night. Silas Croft, guided by a new, almost holy sense of purpose, led the way back to the town, leaving Elder Thompson and the other man to recover in the impossible warmth of Alara's shelter. He returned with 4 more men, a makeshift sledge, and his wife, who was clutching their daughter Martha to her chest. The small child was wrapped in every blanket they owned, but her skin was still icy to the touch, and her breathing was a faint, shallow whisper. When they brought Martha into the earth shelter, the change was almost instantaneous. The stable, radiant warmth of the room began to seep into her small body, fighting back the deep chill that had taken root in her lungs. Alara, moving with a calm competence that awed the frightened parents, prepared a broth on her small fire and helped coax a few spoonfuls into the child. Within an hour, a touch of color had returned to Martha's cheeks. For the first time in 2 days, she was not shivering. Throughout the night, the shelter became a refugee camp. The men made several more perilous trips, bringing back the weakest and most vulnerable from the town, the elderly, the other sick children, and those families who had completely exhausted their fuel. The space became crowded, with 16 souls finding sanctuary within the stone walls that one woman's hands had carved. They huddled together, a collection of chastened, humbled skeptics, their former derision replaced by a silent, overwhelming reverence. Not one of them had lost a family member to the blizzards of their homelands. Not one of them had a grandmother who spoke of living within the earth. Not one of them had ever considered that their rigid, iron and timber solutions were an arrogant imposition on the land, rather than a partnership with it. And not one of them, sitting in the life-saving warmth of Alara's home, would ever again doubt the wisdom they had so easily scorned. They watched her as she moved among them, tending to the sick, sharing her meager food supplies, and nursing her own newborn child, a serene Madonna in a sandstone cathedral of her own making. The blizzard finally broke on the morning of the 5th day. A brilliant, merciless sun shone down on a transformed world. Providence was a landscape of immense, sculpted drifts, with only the peaks of the cabin roofs visible. The town was crippled, entombed in snow. The silence that followed the storm was as profound as the wind's fury had been. It was the silence of devastation. In the days that followed, the true cost of the storm was revealed. 5 people had died in their homes, frozen to death after their fires went out. Dozens more suffered from severe frostbite. Nearly every cabin had sustained some form of damage. The town's livestock was almost entirely wiped out. Providence had survived, but it was broken. The center of the town's recovery, however, was not the half-destroyed town hall or the icy church. It was Ilara's earth shelter. It became a temporary hospital, a community kitchen, and a council room. The survivors, led by a deeply humbled Silas Croft and a penitent Elder Thompson, worked together to dig out their homes and begin the long process of rebuilding. But their perspective had fundamentally shifted. They were no longer just rebuilding cabins. They were reconsidering the very nature of shelter. In the spring of 1877, as the great mountains of snow finally melted to reveal the greening prairie, a new kind of construction began in Providence. Under the quiet guidance of Ilara, the men of the town, using her dwelling as a model, began to excavate a series of larger, interconnected shelters into the south-facing bluff. Silas Croft, with his blacksmith's understanding of stress and structure, designed new, more efficient tools for cutting the sandstone. Elder Thompson, who had once quoted scripture about man's dominion over the earth, now preached about the wisdom of living as a part of it. Ilara never sought a position of leadership, yet she became the unquestioned heart of the community. She did not need to remind them of their folly. The memory of the great blizzard was seared into their collective consciousness. Her vindication was not in words, but in the quiet, steady breathing of the children who had survived the storm within her walls. It was in the solid, warm feel of the new earthen homes that would ensure the town would never again be so vulnerable to the Dakota winter. She remained in her original dwelling, raising her son Samuel in the silent, secure embrace of the earth. Her home, once derided as a badger hole and a testament to folly, was now known as the Founder's Hearth. Travelers passing through would be taken to see it, and the story of the pregnant widow who saved a town by listening to the forgotten wisdom of her ancestors became a local legend, a cautionary tale about the arrogance of convention and a reverent testament to the enduring power of a single, resolute will. Ilara had not set out to be a savior. She had only wanted a safe place to bring her child into the world. In doing so, she had created a sanctuary not just for her own family, but for an entire community, proving that the deepest strength often lies not in fighting the storm, but in finding shelter within the quiet, unyielding heart of the world itself.